Okay, we're back. I did do a little bit of work between lessons. It's actually not very much. I just kind of messed around a bit with some more of the attract, repel, part, noise, and some smooth. It still isn't quite where it needs to be. I'm actually a little happier with the upper chest here. I did end up adding more fur, and I'm happy with the back and the upper arms. It's really the lower arms I've kind of messed with a little bit, but they're not quite looking the way I want yet. I'm gonna have to find some better reference images to get what I do want there. But the rest of it's getting close. I think it's a good time now to go in and discuss setting up the primitives. Now, even if you're not done with your overall groom yet, it's actually okay to go in and work on the primitives. They can be worked on concurrently. So the primitives are what actually get rendered. Remember, this here does not render at all. Now, we produced those earlier by using these buttons up here. We click this to actually produce the fur there, or the primitives. And we can use that to kill it back out. To make this a little bit easier to see, I'm going to go ahead and shut off my visibility for the actual groom. And we'll go ahead and click that and turn it on. Keep in mind it's only going to show up what's actually in the viewport, or it's only rather going to create what's in the viewport. You can see when I go there, that cuts off. That's just a method of saving time. And I believe it's actually using the resolution gate, which is one sometimes if you're kind of zoomed in like this, click the button. You won't always get everything in there, especially if you have a wider screen. So don't worry too much about it. It will all render in the end. Let's go ahead and jump over to the primitives tab. This is where we're going to actually set these up. Now, if we take a look at what we have right now, they look just like these little kind of cylinders that are sticking out. You can see we never can quite see the front of them, or excuse me, the tip of them, and that's because it's kind of a cheat. They really are just kind of pseudo flat cards right now that just have a tube-like shade across them. So we can actually change that in a little bit. Now, when we go and start looking at our options here, the generate primitives does not need to be changed and really shouldn't be. Random across surface is the way we wanted to generate it to work with our grooming tools. There are other things here like uniform columns and rows, specified locations. Those are a little bit more for when we're dealing with the spline mode or when we're individually placing objects or in the geometry mode. Okay, we've already talked about the mask over here and this density, and we can actually turn this down. Remember, we deliberately made sure, under modifiers, under grooming over here, that we shut off our sync. Well, it looks like I accidentally left that on. I will make sure to shut it off now. It's a good thing I remembered to check that. What this is going to do is not allow this density to control this density. And that's because I actually want to up this one or maybe lower it to see or render less hairs in the viewport. Let's drop this to maybe 50. And we'll go ahead and click this button here. And you can see it's a little bit less dense than it was before. We can drop it even to, let's say, 10. And again, it's even less dense now. This is going to be probably a little bit easier for us to see while we're figuring out the shape of them. You can see when they're fully, let's say, up to 200 over here, it can be a bit hard to tell what's quite going on. So I think 10 is a good number for the density right now. And you could see if we were to come back to grooming and turn on the visibility of the groom, it doesn't affect it. It's all still there at the full 150. Okay. So let's go ahead and drop down. And the first two options we want to look at are compensate normals and compensate for uneven parameterization. Compensate for normals is going to, and it's on by default, as you can see here, is going to add or remove hairs based on places where the normals kind of turn in very sharply. Things like down here under the armpits. You can see if I turn that off and regenerate, it's going to change where we have hairs, and we tend to get a little bit more in certain areas. I don't have a perfect mathematical explanation to how it actually works, but areas with tight normals and tight curvature tend to get less hairs with that on. By the way, you'll notice that I have to keep clicking here to change this. However, it's updating super quick now because we dropped this down to just a density of 10. What we can do is come up here and now turn on Update Preview automatically, and you'll notice that now it'll change just as I click it. You can see actually it isn't changing there as much as I thought it was. It is actually changing quite a bit more across this pecs though. Now we can also compensate for uneven parameterization. This has nothing to do with the angle but the size of the faces. So when I turn this on, you notice I get way, oops, actually it's not too bad there. Let's try that again. Try turning that one off. Typically, you will get way less hairs with this one on. I think now because I don't have a very high density, we don't see that as much. Let's try turning it to like 100. Try turning that on, and there you go. So it becomes a little more pronounced at higher densities. So what's happening here is areas that have very small polygons versus very large polygons. Large polygons can't have, rather small polygons cannot have as many hairs as large ones just based on room. So what they'll do here is remove hairs from the larger polygons to basically even it out. So both the small and large typically have a similar density. This is actually probably a pretty good option to have on depending on how your character is put together. For me, this guy is actually fairly evenly parameterized, and that's because I used ZBrush's topology plugin, I already forgot what it's called, the ZRemesher. So they're fairly even, they're all quads. However, if you have very, very tight areas, maybe especially around the fingers, this isn't a bad idea to keep on. You do have to keep pumping your density higher with it though. We're going to go ahead and leave that off for now, and let me go ahead and drop this back down to 10. So there's only a few other options we really need to look at. We're going to come down here. We're not changing primitive type. We are leaving it as spline. And the next thing we want to look at is our modifier count. So that's kind of the detail level of each of these hairs. If I drop this to like 1, 3 looks like it's a minimal, it only has like 3 points per hair. If I go up to something like 15, it has 15 per hair. Now these hairs don't have a lot of detail on them at the moment anyway, so it's not a huge difference, but once we add like a lot of noise to it through our modifiers, this is going to be a very valuable option. Put it back to 5 for right now. Next, we can adjust the width of the hair. Notice by default, it's actually the same from the root to the tip. Now, just by dropping down this here, you could see the tip gets thinner. See, we can kind of see that there almost in real time. You can also make the root thinner if you wanted to. Okay. Now, before you use this, you also have a similar option here called the taper. So increase the taper. It's actually thinning the hair down along the length. And we can actually change where that taper begins. So you can see we can change it so that it only thins out at the very, very edge. Okay. For me, I'd like these hairs to be fairly thin. I will use the taper. Go ahead and bring that down right there. But I'm going to go ahead and also bring down our overall width here a bit as well. Just to kind of thin this out a bit more and give the hairs a very, very kind of thin and wispy appearance towards the ends. Okay, let's go ahead and take a quick render and see how those look. I'm going to go ahead and pause while I do that. Now, as you can see, they are still fairly thick. They're not nearly as thin as they look. Now, this is zoomed in just based on our gate over there, but they're still fairly large. So let's go ahead and thin those out some more. Now, you do have another control for thinning these out. I have seen some inconsistencies as to when it works and when it doesn't under grooming over here. That's this width right here. Drop this to maybe 0.3 and take a render again. Cool, there we go. And as you can see, we haven't had much change really. Now, it literally occurred to me while I was doing this that it might actually have something to do with the sync over here. That may not just affect density, maybe it affects the width too. But either way, it's easy enough to come back over here and go ahead and adjust that change. You can see the width is piped into it right here, so I'm not entirely sure why we don't see a huge change, but it's okay. Go ahead and bring this down some more. And let's see if that kind of looks a little closer to what we want to see. Now, that is still a bit thick, but I think it's quite a bit better, at least for right now. Let's go ahead and shut that gate off. Now, there's a couple other options we can look at over here. Most of it you can see is connected to the actual groom tools. We can actually tilt the hairs on their normals. So if you want to kind of adjust that overall, it adjusts every single hair. You can also rotate them around their normals. These rarely need to be adjusted. The whole point is we spent time on our groom, so why use an overall effect like this? I'm sure there's reasons, but for the most part, we don't really need that. Now, the last thing down here is under options. We can actually change whether the width is even displayed in the viewport, so you can shut that off entirely. And we can also change whether it uses that tube shading. You can see when I turn that off, each one is actually shaded like a flat piece of geometry instead of a cylinder. And that will give you a different render effect. Actually very similar to what you see here. We can also shut off whether these objects face the camera by default. That's a very bad idea with either one of these, with tube shade or with, or basically with, I guess you can call it flat shade. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and leave tube shade on, and some of these things we'll cover probably later. So let's go ahead and pump our resolution back up. And you can see we have at least a nicer appearance to the fur. It still needs quite a bit of work, but I think we're good for right now. So I'm going to go ahead and save, and in the next lesson, we're going to begin talking about modifiers to affect this hair. So I'll see you guys there.